So now we are going to take a look at the human digestive system. And that is the topic for 7.3, just digestion. We're going to look at what happens when you eat your apple and where that goes and the process of its travels through the human body. So let's start with the mouth. When you are eating your food, two things happen in the mouth. The digestion involves both physical and chemical changes in matter throughout the body, but that begins in the mouth, and it's pretty obvious that the physical digestion has to do with the mechanical process of chewing. As you chew, not only is the food broken down physically, but it also allows for some of the chemicals to reach and swirl about your food and do the job that they're going to do. That's the chemical digestion part. Digestive enzyme amylase is the main enzyme involved in breaking down starch in the mouth, and it breaks it down into smaller molecules chemically, while your teeth are breaking down the molecules physically. After you swallow, that amylase continues to digest the starch for about 30 more minutes. Swallowing itself is a very interesting process. Food is forced from your mouth into the throat, and it enters the esophagus, the long tube that then leads into the stomach. When it enters the esophagus, a flap of cartilage called the epiglottis usually closes over the opening to the respiratory tract to prevent food from entering there. And probably you've all noticed that sometimes if you laugh or talk while you're swallowing and eating, sometimes that epiglottis doesn't do its job very well, and you get a little bit of food down into your respiratory tract. Peristalsis is the mechanism by which the food is pushed through the esophagus. It is also the mechanism by which food particles are moved through the entire digestive tract. And here's a little diagram representing that. The involuntary smooth muscles that we talked about before, they contract and they move the particles down the esophagus and into the stomach. And this just shows that as they contract, this food particle then gets pushed along the esophagus and then into the stomach. So let's look at the stomach. It's the next location on the digestive tract here. First, we have the physical digestion in the stomach. We have 3 layers of involuntary muscle that are contracting in order to break down the food physically. They also mix it with the gastric juices, and that brings us to the chemical digestion piece in the stomach. The chemical digestion is where we have the gastric juices that contain pepsin, which is an enzyme, and hydrochloric acid. The reason the acid is present is that pepsin, the enzyme, works best in a very acidic environment. Now, one question that is always a good question to ask: how does the stomach lining withstand the strong acids in it? Why don't the acids just eat away the stomach? Because the stomach secretes mucus, and it forms a protective layer inside that lines the stomach and keeps it protected. The time frame for digestion in the stomach is about 2 to 4 hours, at which point the food has now become a very thin liquid. Then, remember we talked about peristalsis. Those peristaltic waves force small amounts of that liquid out of the lower end of the stomach and into the small intestine, where they're going to now begin their next part of this journey. Now let's look at the small intestine. So we've come out of the stomach with this digesting food, entering the small intestine, and the mechanical digestion continues with muscles contracting in the small intestine. The chemical digestion also continues. Enzymes are produced and secreted by the pancreas and the liver. And we'll talk about what those are in a little bit. The very first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. Some people call it the duodenum. It really doesn't matter how you pronounce it. It is simply the very first 25 centimeters of the small intestine. And the small intestine, incidentally, is named because it is smaller in diameter than the next portion of the intestine, which are called the large intestine. It's the diameter of the tube that is small in the small intestine. So we have a few other organs that come to play here. We have the pancreas. And in this picture, there's the pancreas, kind of a pink color in the picture. It's a soft, flattened gland, and it secretes digestive enzymes and hormones. It also, the secretions are alkaline or basic, and that helps neutralize the acidity as the liquid is coming from the stomach. It stops the action of the pepsin at that point. The liver also has a part in this process. The liver itself has many, many different functions. One of its many functions is to produce bile, and that's all we're going to talk about right here. Bile is a chemical that breaks down fats. It's stored in the gallbladder. So here we have our liver, and one of its functions is producing bile. It stores it in this gallbladder right here, and then from there it is passed on into the duodenum, the very first part of the small intestine. So the time frame of this. The liquid food takes 3 to 5 hours in the small intestine. It moves through the small intestine via peristalsis. And one more item of note are villi. Villi are little projections on the lining of the small intestine. They give surface area and allow, because of that surface area, they allow more absorption of digested food. The digested food in the small intestine, once it is completely digested there, it can be absorbed directly into those cells of the villi. Now, our process is moving along into the large intestine. And here we have a representation of the large intestine. And indigestible material now passes into the large intestine. So not everything is digested. The large intestine is also sometimes called the colon. So either of those terms refers to the same thing. It is much wider than the small intestine, and the functions are as follows. As materials pass through the large intestine, water and salts are absorbed by the intestine walls, leaving behind a more solid material. Therefore, your body conserves that water and takes it back up. Also, the large intestine functions in some vitamin synthesis. It synthesizes some B vitamins and vitamin K. And also, there are bacteria present in the large intestine, and they are useful to stop harmful bacteria from colonizing in the body, and that reduces the risk of intestinal infections. So, time frame on the large intestine, about 18 to 24 hours. And the remaining indigestible material is now, at this point, called feces and eliminated via the rectum through the anus. The total time for our meal's journey from the very beginning to the very end is roughly 24 to 33 hours. So here's a little overview of some of the digestive enzymes that are involved in digestion. The organ, for example, if you remember, we talked about salivary glands producing the amylase. That's the enzyme. Amylase digests starch, and it breaks it down into smaller disaccharides. Remember our enzyme pepsin that was in the stomach. It digests proteins and breaks them down into these smaller peptide molecules. The pancreas, we didn't mention these, but these are some of the different enzymes that are produced by the pancreas, a type of amylase, trypsin, pancreatic lipase, and nucleases. So a little typo there, sorry about that. The molecules those digest are listed here: starch, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids, and these are the products that are produced when they digest those molecules. The small intestine has these enzymes: maltase, sucrase, lactase, peptidase and nuclease, and they work on these molecules to break them down into those smaller molecules. So some of the main ones to know would be these that we talked about, but it's always interesting to understand a little bit more about some of these other enzymes that are helping to chemically digest the food that we eat. So here's some advanced ideas. Feel free to come up with your own ideas, and I look forward to seeing you in class.